Hello, welcome. My name is Lucan. I'm professor of political science at the University of Toronto and co-director of the Petro Jacyk program for the study of Ukraine. Good afternoon. Today we're going to discuss the Baltic states and the relationship to the Russo-Ukrainian war. Now, the Baltic states really represent a kind of unique member of the coalition in support of Ukraine. They are among the most vulnerable to Russian attack. I think it's kind of undeniable. At the same time, they've been, as we'll discuss later, they've been the most sort of constant supporters and sort of enthusiastic supporters of Ukraine since the conflict began in February. At the same time, they sort of more broadly kind of represent kind of a bridge, I guess you might say, between the former Soviet Union and Europe. On the one hand, they're definitely former Soviet. They were part of the Soviet Union until between Second World War and 1991. At the same time, they've always been sort of treated somewhat differently. And in particular, they were allowed, given the possibility of joining the European Union much earlier, obviously, than Ukraine back in the early 2000s. So today we're just going to discuss the Baltic reaction to the war. We have three important scholars from each of the Baltic states. First, from my home institution, University of Toronto, we have Andres Kasekamp, who's professor of history at the University of Toronto. He was, before that, professor of Baltic politics at the University of Tartu in Estonia and director of the Estonian Foreign Policy Institute. His first book was The Radical Right into Estonia, and he has also written a book, A History of the Baltic States, published in 2010. He's been on a million different foreign affairs committees of various parliaments in Canada, Finland, European Union, and the like. Next, from Latvia, we have Janeta Ozolina, I hope I pronounced that right, an expert in security. She's the chairwoman of the Latvian Transatlantic organization and professor of international relations at the University of Latvia. Janeta is the author of over 100 scholarly articles and editor of several books on security in the Baltic region. She was chairwoman of the Strategic Analysis Commission under the auspices of the President of Latvia from 2004 to 2008, and a member of the European Research Area Board in 2008 to 2012. She also chairs the Foreign Affairs Council of the Latvian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and is a member of the European Council of Foreign Relations and the Alphen Group. Janeta is representative of the Boston Global Forum in Latvia. Finally, but last but certainly not least, we have Tomas Janeliūnas, who's from Lithuania, as a specialist in security and energy. And he's a professor at the Institute of International Relations and Political Science at Vilnius University, chief research officer of the Eastern Europe Studies Center. Janeliūnas is also director of a nonprofit organization, Energy Research Institute. He's written this book, the Palgrave Handbook of Zero Carbon Energy Systems and Energy Transitions. Okay, so we have a wide range of experts across the Baltic region. So I'm going to actually start with you, Andres. If you could sort of provide a general kind of historical context of the Baltics' troubled relationship to Russia. I first became acquainted with Estonia when I was a student in Moscow in early 1989. I was hanging out with the Russian Democrats, and I remember their shocked reaction to the first meeting of the Estonian Popular Front. There was a Russian Socialist Democrat, Boris Kagarlitsky, and he was, I think he had kind of envisioned this sort of Soviet-wide pro-democracy movement, and that's certainly not, and he was sort of taken aback by the Estonian and Baltic sort of insistence on independence. And of course, the Baltic states played a really important role in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So maybe if you could just give us a kind of broad sweep analysis and sort of talk about the Baltic transition to democracy in 1991 as well.
All right, thank you, Lucan. It's wonderful to be here with my old friends and colleagues and to be discussing the Baltic states. Let me just highlight a few moments in the struggle for the recovery of independence in the late 80s, early 90s, collapse of the Soviet Union, and transition to democracy and free market reform. Because I know Janeta will pick up from there and talk about the accession to the European Union and NATO, which are two topics also close to my heart. But first of all, let me say what differentiates the Baltic states from the other former Soviet republics at the time, and particularly to Ukraine, because we're talking about Ukraine in this series, is that the Baltic states had a living memory of statehood. So the Baltic states were independent. They were members of the League of Nations between the two world wars before they were illegally occupied by the Soviets, then the Nazis, and then the Soviets again at the end of the Second World War. So when independence was restored, there were people who remembered what an independent Estonia looked like, what a free market economy looked like, and also some who had memories of how a democracy functioned, even though these three countries by the end of the 30s had become authoritarian in a mild form. So that was very important in restoring this independence. And that's the key word as well, that it was restoration. They weren't successor states to the Soviet Union as such, which meant that they were able to reestablish the diplomatic ties with other countries on the basis that they had earlier. And the struggle within the Soviet system. So Lucan, you mentioned sort of a key point, 1988, the first popular front in the Soviet Union was in Estonia. And of course, the full title to it was the Estonian Popular Front in Support of Perestroika. So they were very cleverly using the framework and concepts that Gorbachev was pushing for his reforms to instead push for, well, democratization, but that also meant in the long run, independence. First of all, autonomy, and then finally full independence. And that idea spread rapidly to Latvia and Lithuania, and then to the other republics of the Soviet Union. And that was in the summer of 1988, the so-called Singing Revolution, this non-violent, peaceful way of demonstrating the will of the people through massive choral singing. Again, first in Estonia, and then Latvia and Lithuania. And another key point, 1988, November, the Estonian Declaration on Sovereignty within the USSR, which was then copied by the other republics, and which I think was one of the key nails in the coffin of the USSR when Russia, under Boris Yeltsin, claimed its own sovereignty from the USSR. So these models of resistance to central authority were pioneered in the Baltic region and spread throughout the rest of the Soviet Union and other republics, including Ukraine, but also importantly into Yeltsin's Russia, which imposed Gorbachev's USSR. And what was very important, there was a great societal consensus in all three Baltic states for moving away from the Soviet experiment as quickly as possible and integrating with the West. They knew what they wanted to do. And so this is, again, a difference with, say, Ukraine, which in the 90s had this sort of multi-vector foreign policy that where does it try to balance between the others. But the Baltic states knew very clearly they didn't want to have anything to do whatsoever with the Commonwealth of Independent States, and they knew their place was this return to Europe. And in this, they were helped by having good neighbors, the Scandinavian Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, which helped them on this path in the 90s. And also, let me just, perhaps this final point, not to go on too long, because I've written a whole book on the history of the Baltic states, is that the lesson from the Second World War was the recommendation to the Baltic states in the early 90s by all of our Western friends was, you should be like Finland. You should be a bridge between East and West, a neutral country with a good relationship with Russia. But that was sort of roundly rejected because the lesson of our history was we were neutral, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, at the outbreak of the Second World War. That did not save us. So the lesson was never again alone. Have good allies and as many as possible. And Janeta will be getting into that, of course, with the EU and NATO accession process. And a final word before passing over to Janeta, perhaps, would be that a key moment was also in the early 90s, 93 in Lithuania, 1994 in Estonia and Latvia, when the Russian troop withdrawal was negotiated. So independence was restored in 94, but Russian troops remained in their bases as they did in Ukraine and Georgia and Moldova and elsewhere. And it was crucial for the future success, for the transition in the 90s, that the Russian troops were gone. That would have been a big break on that. And the Baltic states could be in a similar situation to, say, a Moldova today, had the troops not been removed in 94. And that was only thanks to significant pressure from the United States under Bill Clinton, with the trade-off to Yeltsin that you need our economic support and our aid, then you help us by withdrawing your troops, which they weren't very happy to do, and which they tried to connect to the issue of the Russian-speaking minorities in Estonia and Latvia. So I could go on, but I'll stop there for now.
Thanks so much, Andres. So hand it over to you, Janeta. I mean, can you just discuss why? Of course, as we know, the Baltic states were invited to join the European Union much much earlier than Ukraine has, to put it mildly. But even though Ukraine, at least by the late 1990s, expressed rhetorical support for the join the European Union and NATO, can you talk about why was it that the Baltics, in your view, were successful in attracting the European Union? What another way of putting it is sort of what did the European Union see in the Baltics that sort of made them so quickly regard them as potential members?
Yeah, thank you for inviting, and with great pleasure I will focus on EU and NATO, and then later on, after my first remarks, could expand if you are interested in. But I think that the main reasons and main arguments Andreas already put forward. So it was a very simple answer: what is the future of the Baltic states? And it was never again with the Soviet Union. So to run as fast as possible, as quickly as possible, away from the Soviet past. And actually, the way to the European Union and NATO was not so easy as it seems right now, because actually the concept of neutrality was somewhere hanging in the air. Because if we were looking at Finland and Sweden, so this neutrality was part of Nordic identity to some extent. But the Baltic states very quickly learned the lesson. So you can feel neutral if you have very friendly neighbors. But having next to your doors Russia, with all its ambitions and very quick recovery from democratic transition, so I'm putting more into oligarchization of the country and later on Putinization of the country, for the Baltic states it was clear to belong to Europe, to return back to Europe when the Baltic states belonged to, and not to reinvent the wheel. This was simple like that. And by the way, around 92, there were discussions, what about the renewed union? So now, after the very massive movement of People's Front, democratic movements, Russia seemed is going to democratize Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus. Why not to restore a new union? And the Baltic states are very cautious because, again, if you are in the same company with Russia, you cannot expect something good in the end. But there were efforts from, by the way, Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus to have some so-called Baltic Black Sea banana, it was called at that time. Let's do something together regionally, because the EU and NATO were very far away. And by the way, the Baltic states were quite enthusiastic because it was an economic issue, political consultation issue, but actually these were exactly Ukraine, Moldova, and Belarus who decided just to have the same type of relationship with Russia as they had before. They were afraid of our sacrifices, which we had in the late 80s and the beginning of 90s, with the transformation of whole economic system, actually social system was breaking down, and so on. They didn't want to suffer. They wanted to have smooth transition to whatever futures they had in mind at that time. But for the Baltic states, it was clear, just to go back to Europe. If you look what is happening in Europe, it's the European Union. And if you have to fix your security issues, There is no other organization to strive for, which was NATO. So it was simple like that. But what is very important, it's not like the Baltic states were invited to join the European Union, what Lucan said at the very beginning. So first of all, we had to have our consensus at home. And luckily, all three Baltic states had consensus at home, political elites and society. We have to do it together. In Latvia, the situation probably was a little bit more complicated because we have the largest Russian-speaking minority in the Baltic states, which was quite resistant to the EU and NATO membership, but still consensus was there. And when we had this domestic consensus, then application was submitted to the EU. And actually, the EU was not very happy at the very beginning because they were quite happy with Poland, Hungary, Czechs, Slovaks. But the Balts, it's a post-Soviet Union. It's who knows how they will behave. And by the way, I think sometimes we are very critical to Baltic cooperation, but exactly the example which we had in early 90s, that we are able to cooperate, that we are able to put aside our whatever difficulties and discontents which we have, we could agree, we demonstrated very also consolidated Baltic opinion. And therefore in 95, we all at the same moment submitted our applications to the European Union. Estonia were more fortunate because their economy was more open and they were invited to start negotiations earlier in 97. We Lithuanians and Latvians being a little bit slower, we were invited to start negotiations in 99. And in the end, we all three joined in 2004. Very similar path was also with regard to NATO. So we did it again jointly. And also first cooperation projects, they were based on the Baltic security interests. Therefore, we were able quite quickly also to get into NATO. But what is the major difference? I think major difference between the Baltic states and Ukraine is that we had this political elite and society's consensus, and we did it jointly. It was not effort of one political group or one societal group. And the second point was that we clearly knew that we want to be part of Europe. And you cannot be part of Europe as Switzerland or Norway. Small countries, you have to be in a group of allies. And in the EU, we found those economic and political allies and a NATO security allies. So it is a short version, mostly putting forward arguments, but in principle, there was no big discussion whether it is worth. It had to be done. And Ukraine, unfortunately, played a little bit with this multi-vector policy, more or less depending on presidents which they had. But unfortunately, it turned out that it was too late.
Yeah, great, thanks. Yeah, obviously, thanks for correcting my question. Obviously, in hindsight, everything seems much more inevitable than it may have actually been at the time. So, of course, you know that. And I appreciate you pointing that out. So I'll turn to you, Tomas. Do you have anything to comment here? And if you could sort of, well, actually, first, before I get to that, Janeta, can you talk about sort of Russia's reaction to the Baltics joining NATO? You know, obviously that's quite relevant today in terms of comparison. Or so, what was Russia's reaction?
Hi. Hello, Lucan, and all watching and listening us here. So about Russian reactions, of course, Russians were not happy at all, because they thought that, you know, moving into the former Soviet Union territory is a kind of crossing a line, even to say a border line that was at that time dividing this Europe from the potential sphere of influence of Russia, which still, being a weak state at that time, still not so aggressive or not so economically strong, but still Russia at that time already thought that sooner or later we will get back, and we could at least to maintain this influence, political, economical, energy influence, every kind of such a soft power, which Russia used in quite a various way. So this was also, of course, a disappointment in Moscow, seeing that NATO expansion is going deeper into this former Soviet territories. But at that time, this reaction was not so aggressive, which we used to see later. But still, the Baltic states at that time were regarded as a kind of enemies, puppets of the United States, having no opinion of its own. So, and this remained for mostly 2 decades or something like that. And a lot of Russian propaganda was directed at this idea that the Baltic states are not sovereign at all. They are just following the orders by Washington. And, they are just the same enemies as NATO in essence. So the reaction, of course, was not happy at all.
Thanks. Can you maybe talk a bit more, Tomas, about sort of the kind of, or you please step in, Janeta, when you as well. I mean, sort of the overall kind of security vulnerability of the Baltic states. I mean, obviously Lithuania, with its proximity to Kaliningrad and the Suwałki Gap, it seems particularly vulnerable. But can you sort of speak to that?
Sure, but I saw Andres wants to add something.
I'm sorry, I
will join
yeah.
just a little bit after.
Okay, yes. Thank you. To the same question that you just posed, Lucan, about the Russian reaction to NATO enlargement. We tend to forget, of course, that Russia, prior to both NATO enlargement to Central Europe and then to the Baltic countries, NATO and Russia signed agreements, the 1997 NATO-Russia Founding Act, and then before the Baltic states joined in 2002, then there was the NATO-Russia Council that was formed. So this was all going on in parallel when the United States and the Allies were trying to establish a closer relationship with Russia at the time. So it wasn't seen as a zero-sum game from the West at that point. And of course, when the Baltic states joined, they did not really receive, they were kind of second-class members of NATO for a long time. It wasn't until after the invasion of Georgia in 2008 when the Baltic states started asking for, hey, why aren't there any operational plans for our defense? So NATO was very careful, it bent over backwards not to provoke Russia in that early phase. It was only after the invasion of Georgia and then again 2014 Crimea that NATO presence really became stronger. I just want to add that.
Interesting. So maybe this is a good opportunity to address, some of the kind of misperceptions or kind of, about, by people like Noam Chomsky, who sort of see NATO expansion as being driven by the West and sort of being kind of almost, in some of the rhetoric, almost forced on these countries. I mean, Janeta, what do you think of that? Is that sort of, is that accurate?
Yeah, there are researchers who are just writing and they don't have time for thinking. And if I look at Chomsky's, range of books in the bookstores, I'm really wondering whether it's time to think. And your argument is actually, which you referred to, is one of very clear demonstrations. So first of all, it was not NATO which expanded, but these were countries which were post-Soviet, like Poles first of all, and other countries who knocked at NATO's doors. And NATO actually didn't want to open them. And Bill Clinton was very confused when he received a very strong pressure from lobbies in the Washington, D.C. about opening doors of NATO. And it was approximately 2 years period of time when NATO wanted to invent something which could be replacement to enlargement and partnership for peace initially, was exactly the program which NATO hoped that Baltic states and others will be satisfied. And actually at that time, and I remember it very well, I was engaged in those political discussions. At the very beginning, there was enthusiasm that at least NATO is offering us something serious. But when Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan were invited to join PFP, it was clear that it's not really something hard. So therefore, NATO had to open door because of very, very serious political efforts from political elite, but also society, which wanted to become part of transatlantic community. And this emphasis on being too pro-Americans and just serving American interests, I'm wondering about those arguments which are used even today, because American interests were based on democratic principles. And that's exactly what the Baltic states wanted to do. They wanted to build strong democratic institutions, societies, and so on. But when it comes back to the issue of Russia's reaction to Baltic states' interest to joining those organizations, by the way, at that time, all 3 Baltic states experienced first elements of hybrid war. But we actually didn't understand it, I think, till Alyosha, particularly in Estonia, but also with the school reform demonstrations in Latvia when bilingual education was introduced, and there were huge demonstrations on the street, and there was assumption that those demonstrations will stop Latvia's membership in the EU and NATO. And there are very many such kind of checks how far Russia can go, which policies work and which doesn't work. Like, for instance, citizenship issues. There was some kind of manipulation with Russian-speaking minorities. So you don't need Latvian citizenship. When you will join the European Union, you will get European citizenship. And not a lot of such things. Or the border agreement between Latvia and Russia, Estonia and Russia. So these manipulation techniques were put at place at that time. So therefore, for us, it's not surprise what Russia was doing in Georgia in 2008, what was doing in Ukraine, Crimea, and Eastern Ukraine later in 2014. We already experienced that.
Interesting. Yeah, important. Thanks. So Tomas, maybe I'll turn it back to you, and maybe you could sort of touch on the Vlasov Gap and sort of other kind of security issues.
Yeah, sure. And I will try just to share a map what this Vlasov Gap is actually. So this is a very short distance between Belarus and Kaliningrad district of Russia. It's almost 60 miles wide. It's just quite a short corridor. Potential corridors, as you would like to call it. It's a border between Poland and Lithuania, actually. So this kind of attraction point, or to say a kind of dangerous point in recent political article was titled as the most dangerous place on Earth, arguing that Vlasov Gap, this narrow strip between Kaliningrad district and Belarus, would likely be the first point of contact between the NATO and Russia's military forces in a case of conflict. Yeah.
Can you just, sorry, just a quick bit of background. When was it created? You sort of, was it, how did it come about?
Well, this discussion started just strategically thinking about potential military conflict between.
I mean the Vlasov Gap itself. Like, when was it created? I mean, it obviously didn't exist during the Soviet period. So was it sort of did it come in 1991 or sort of around there?
This concept is just a kind of I don't know. It is not a physically important point between Lithuania and Poland. It's just a kind of conception to say what's the weakest point within NATO when we talk about potential conflict with Russia. What's the weakest point? So this was just geographically pointed out as maybe a potential starting point of a military conflict, because, as you can see, the concentration of military forces in the Kaliningrad district is very high.
Okay.
So, and what of the maybe first strategic tasks for Russian military would be, in a case of conflict with NATO, just to connect, physically connect this short distance between Belarus and Kaliningrad, not to leave Kaliningrad isolated in the military sense. So, but this is really just a kind of political or military concept, not a very important geographical point. And of course, calling this point as the most dangerous place on Earth is a gross exaggeration and in essence a kind of nonsense. The Lithuanian-Polish border is a very safe place indeed. In military terms, of course, the Baltic countries are still vulnerable. However, the situation is changing very rapidly. Just to say, in Madrid, the last NATO summit, it was decided to increase the NATO forward presence to the level of brigades from battalions. And the Baltic countries are rapidly increasing their military spending. Already this year, Lithuania and Estonia has increased defense spending to 2.5% of GDP. And for the next upcoming years, it can increase even more. Latvia, as far as I heard, is discussing possibilities to introduce compulsory military service for its citizens. So also, Sweden and Finland should soon become NATO members. And this will mean a much stronger defense in the Baltic Sea. So NATO may take the Baltic Sea under its military control, or at least compete with Russian Navy for the Baltic Sea. Because until now, the Russian Navy was just dominant in this area of the Baltic Sea. And NATO, of course, NATO knows about the sensitivity of the Vlasov Gap for a long time. And many military exercises have been played to overcome this potential weakness. So, but I would also like to say that the Baltic states are not the most vulnerable part of NATO. On the contrary, we are much more resistant to Russian pressure than, for example, Germany, because Lithuanians, Latvians, and Estonians used to fight Russian propaganda for decades. And this is extremely difficult now for Kremlin to spread its narrative to the Baltic states. They have already cut off all energy imports from Russia. No oil, gas, or electricity is being imported from Russia right now. So we have no trade dependency on Russia anymore. In economic, energy, and political spheres, we are much more secure and much more resistant from Russia's influence than other European countries. But of course, the military question is still the most important one, because, of course, the Baltic states know that Russian aggression, if not stopped in Ukraine, may turn to Baltic states as well. So that's why it's so important for us how this conflict in Ukraine ends. And that's why we are so supportive for Ukrainians and in every sense.
Great, and we'll certainly come back to this issue. So now I want to take us to sort of, the invasion itself, and I'm going to show this this figure here. I think, is this showing here? So this, sorry, I don't know why it's also showing that. Anyway, so here we have, this is as of July of this year. This shows the support given to Ukraine as a share of GDP, since January. And this kind of demonstrates, I think, quite nicely just how much in the forefront the Baltic states have been in supporting Ukraine, which at one level, is not surprising. But another level, I mean, given their sort of military vulnerability, for example, Georgia, has had a very different reaction despite its, the fact that the population is quite supportive of Ukraine. Andres, can you sort of talk, in general terms about sort of, about the sort of the Baltic, the initial Baltic reaction to the invasion?
Sure. I think we still have the chart up, but it's very accurate to show that Estonia is in the lead there and has been throughout the whole conflict in supplying, first of all, military equipment, and of course also humanitarian assistance. And I think all three of our countries were right off the bat, before the conflict started, already supplying the Ukrainians with lethal aid, because they realized basically that this is our own front line. And as Tomas said, that if the Russians are successful in Ukraine, who could be next? Well, the attention is turned towards us. So Ukraine's struggle is definitely our struggle, and that's being recognized by not only the political elites, the government in our three countries, but very widely by society as well. Of course, we could also talk about the Russian minorities in Estonia and Latvia, which is kind of different take on these things, but the enthusiasm that Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians have shown for supporting Ukraine, not just through official means, but through all sorts of private initiatives, like Lithuanians crowdsourcing to buy drones for the Ukrainians, for example, is a good one. And also, of course, they've been very welcoming to Ukrainian refugees, which is remarkable, because when there was the European refugee crisis in 2015 with Syria, then the Baltic states were very reluctant and apprehensive. But in this case, they have been very, very welcoming, because they very much identify with the Ukrainians and their plight. For instance, I'll give you the figures for Estonia. Estonia has 40,000 Ukrainian refugees, which is about the same number as, I believe, Canada now. But the population of Estonia is just over 1 million, which means it's about 3% of the population today in Estonia are Ukrainian refugees. And that is quite remarkable. And most of them, they're not in any refugee camps. Most of them are being housed in people's homes, or they're renting apartments themselves. So this is, of course, if we talk about Poland being the largest country in this situation, but it's a remarkable change as well. And I would also add that our leaders, and here I have to sort of tout Estonia's role, particularly Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, has been remarkably present in the international media, making the case for supporting Ukraine militarily and not caving into Russia's demands. And particularly all of our leaders have been trying to make the point, unlike Emmanuel Macron, that Putin needs to be humiliated in Ukraine. We're not there to save his face.
Right, yeah. Well, Estonia certainly has, I think, no offense to the other Baltic states, the coolest prime minister, at least that's from social media. Janeliūnas, can you sort of comment on these issues about the reaction of the Baltics to the February invasion?
Our prime minister is cool as well.
Okay, it's all right. I didn't want to start a inter-Baltic war.
Because he is present internationally as well, and by the way, he is on very good terms with the Estonian prime minister.
Okay.
They very often actually appear both. But anyway, so yes, indeed, Latvia as well as Estonia and Lithuania very actively supported Ukraine, and reaction was very clear. So from the very first day. And what I would like to emphasize is, first of all, that Latvia supplied lethal weapons before the war started. So it was a preparation in advance. Secondly, Latvia from the very first day built some kind of, if I could call it, government's policy framework, which was very much targeted at supporting Ukraine in very different ways. And I also would like to emphasize that public opinion substantially changed. It's 180 degrees with regard to refugees, because such a huge humanitarian support and unity, which was evident in the first months of the war, I couldn't even imagine in Latvia, having in mind previous experience how the migration issue was treated before that. We have slightly less migrants than Estonia, but still these are very huge numbers for Latvia. And for instance, on top of what Andreas already said, we, by the way, have even special school programs. Now there are school camps for children learning Latvian language in order to start schools in autumn. So the whole system now is built to support refugees and to help them incorporate into society. And there is a huge difference probably from a group, I would say, group of Russian speakers in Latvia who even don't try to speak and learn Latvian language. Majority of Ukrainians from the very first day learn Latvian language and they try to be part of Latvian society. So I think from that point of view, it's really very, very some kind of a good sign of Latvian society as well, how they react to this situation. And the last point which I wanted to mention, there was a concern that, as it happens with majority of wars, after a couple of months, the society's attention gets somewhere. But it's not the case with Ukraine's war. And one of the reasons is because, as Andreas said, it's a front line. And we realized it very well. If Russia's appetite grows, we would be the next target of Russia's ambitions. And therefore, we would like to help as much as possible in order to win this war.
Great, thanks for raising that point. I mean, that's been an issue for us, even in Canada, which, obviously, as we have great interest in the conflict, but, you do sort of see eventually kind of attention waning. And here at the Monk School at the Petro Jacyk, we're trying to sort of really focus on keeping Ukraine up in the people's attention. So I want to ask, I'm going to throw it out to the three of you, and whoever wants to take this first. I mean, obviously, it's obvious, it's not surprising, I guess, that the Latvians and Estonians and Lithuanians would be quite supportive of Ukraine and, and kind of empathize with them. But what about the Russian minorities in each of these cases, your cases? I mean, what has there been their reaction? Yeah.
I'll probably start because several public opinion surveys were carried out in Latvia. And the one was published only yesterday, so therefore it's very hot. But in principle, there is no surprise that Russian speakers in Latvia are very divided in their opinion on Russia's war in Ukraine. And approximately 20% of Russian speakers fully support Ukraine and they don't have any questions what is happening there. Approximately 20% support Russia. And we even have a new term. We call those Russia supporters not Russians but Putinists, because there are plenty of Russians who are on the same line as majority of Europeans. But then what is not surprising, but still to some extent is, that approximately 60%, now it's a little bit less, 50%, still they are unclear on the situation. And they are stating they don't support any of sides. Mm-hmm. And therefore, this is a question whether they don't want to demonstrate their opinion, or they definitely could be in a very awkward situation because business was done with Russia, Russian investments in Latvia were present, gas we were buying from Russia. So it seems that Russia is part of, let's say, our neighborhood, and suddenly our neighborhood becomes our enemy. So therefore, I assume that there are certain groups of Russians who are confused. But still, it's very divided opinion. And what is interesting is that also Ukrainians living in Latvia, they are also divided. It's not like, because when I'm using this term Russian speakers, we have to keep in mind that in Russia, In Latvia, Russian language is used in families of Belarusians, Ukrainians, sometimes Poles, sometimes Jewish people. So it's a very widely used language. So Russian speakers are those who are speaking at home. So therefore, families can be divided and so on. But what is a positive sign, and this is from the recent survey, that among younger generation, there are less those who support Russia. And this is a positive sign. So younger generation who was born here, they consider themselves as part of Latvia and part of Europe. So therefore, their identity is not divided by very strange mental border. So yeah, it's difficult. Definitely it's difficult, but I think that finally Latvian government is very clear on that. No compromises anymore. All education in state-financed schools since 2025 will be in Latvian language. That's it. So it's enough.
Yeah. So I mean, I guess it's not too surprising that, you know, I'm assuming much of the Russian-speaking population was involved in trade with Russia, and so it's not too surprising, I guess, that they would be more ambivalent about you know, the events. Andres, do you want to step in?
Yeah, I will just add 2 points about this, that we see very often in international media lots of stories of reporters going to Eastern Estonia or Eastern Latvia and asking the locals there, what do they think of Putin? Who do they believe Crimea belongs to? It was already back in 2014 a hot question. And then you get these headlines about, uh-oh, Estonia or Latvia are next because you have all of these pro-Putinists there. But I would submit that the reporters who are going to the Russian dominant, in terms of linguistically dominant areas of Eastern Estonia and Latvia, are asking the wrong question. Of course, they're going to be saying that they admire Putin and that Crimea belongs to Russia, not Ukraine. But if they ask a question such as, do you want to exchange the euros in your pocket for rubles? Do you want to exchange free movement in the Schengen zone in Europe for free movement in the Commonwealth of Independent States? Do you want to exchange the health services and the pension services in Estonia and Latvia for those in Russia? Then you would, I think, get a more accurate and authentic answer as to where these people belong, even if they might have sympathy for the Russian cause otherwise. But that doesn't mean that they want to be personally part of the Russian world, that the Russian world would come to them. And the second point I wanted to make is, I hope with this war that finally we'll get over this false equivalency of everyone who's a Russian speaker is somehow pro-Russian. Because we see in Ukraine that sort of, oh, you know, between East and West, that the Russian speakers versus the Ukrainian speakers, right? And Russia is, you know, killing the Russian speakers that it's claiming to protect. And in the Baltic states, for years, the main subject of interest academically, journalistically, diplomatically, has always been the situation with the Russian-speaking minority and how they're treated. So I think maybe some eyes are opening as to how Russia actually treats Russian speakers, that it's not out to physically protect them, but as you can see in Ukraine, they're just a tool and are actually being killed by the Russian state.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I think, you know, very much speaks to my experience in Eastern Ukraine, where I lived in Donetsk in the 1990s, and you know, I think, you know, almost everyone I knew there, you know, was deeply attached to Russian culture, but it was also passionately in support of Ukrainian independence. And so I think, you know, those are two very different things. Especially, you know, it's very easy to kind of course, say yes, you know, Krim nash, you know, Crimea is ours. But it's quite another thing to say, well, I'm going to give up the prosperity of where I'm living, you know, to live in Putin's Russia. And I think it's a great point that just because you speak Russian or identify with Russian or Soviet culture does not mean that you therefore want to leave the country you're living in, which is quite a different thing. So thanks. So Tomas, I'm going to go to you now. And first of all, if you have anything to comment on these issues, but second, I sort of actually wanted to discuss a little bit of sort of this. Well, first of all, do you have anything to say on these issues, Tomas?
About minority.
Yeah, or just
well, you know, in Lithuania we had quite a small Russian-speaking minority until this war, just about 4 or 5% of our population, and I didn't see any big divisions within this part of the society. Even some of Russian speakers, they were very supportive for Ukraine, and some of them even started some public initiatives how to collect money and other donations to Ukraine. So there are many Russian-speaking persons who are thinking in the same categories as Lithuanians. So there is no big difference here, I think.
Yeah. So I want to then touch on sort of something that sort of kind of puzzled me for a number of years, which is sort of Lithuania's seemingly kind of maverick foreign policy, right? I mean, at least my memory in the 80s, I'm sure you, Andres and Janeta, will passionately disagree. My memory is that the Lithuanians were sort of on the forefront to really demand independence from the USSR. And then we have now Lithuania having a, you know, rejected China, having a relationship with Taiwan. You know, Lithuania has been very active in supporting the Belarusian opposition and sort of, you know, as opposed to, sort of, you know, and the like. So can you talk a little bit about this sort of maverick, if I have this right, Tomas, the sort of maverick quality of Lithuanian foreign policy?
Well, of course, to some extent it could be related to this kind of historical experience, being the first who left Soviet Union officially, declaring this independence in early 1990. And but right now, I think it's more related to the political ideology of ruling parties. The ruling coalition right now, consisting of the Conservative Party and 2 liberal parties, this ruling coalition was openly declaring to pursue so-called value politics. In other words, to the government is very vocal in opposing authoritarian regimes, being in Russia, Belarus, or China. Putin's regime has always been the main target of Lithuanian criticism. I mean, I may remind you that the former president of Lithuania, Dalia Grybauskaitė, called Russia a terrorist state back in 2014, just after the Crimea events. And now the Lithuanian parliament has announced that Russia should be considered as a terrorist state in an official resolution. But the current position of Lithuania is not so very different from the former policy. I think maybe the current government is doing it a bit more bluntly and more decisively, just trying to resemble those early stages of Lithuanian Conservative Party, just being a good followers of Mr. Landsbergis, who was a hero at that time proclaiming Lithuanian independence. And knowing that our foreign minister is a grandson of Vytautas Landsbergis, so he is just following, in some extent, the same path. So he wants also maybe to leave a kind of sign in a history, being not shy, declaring this support for fighters against Russia. But of course, this kind of value politics is challenged by political opposition in Lithuania as well. I just say there is not so acceptable, especially in tactical way, not so acceptable decisions in Lithuanian domestic politics. So, and it is not so easy to maintain this kind of maverick image for Lithuania, because it costs in the popularity of parties, sometimes even in some economic material costs, which caused by some sanctions from China, for example. So, but at the end of the day, I think it is also related to a very clear image what Lithuanian politicians right now wants to present to the world, and they are quite. I would say they're quite sure what they are doing. To say they are doing this in a very consistent way, trying to maintain its positions on international mass media, and trying to declare that yes, Lithuania is still a brave country, which is not lean to any authoritarian pressure, being it's from China or from Russia.
Great. Thanks very much. So that's I want to turn to you, Janeta. I wanted you to sort of, I think, Tomas, I think, or one of you kind of raised this issue. Is it sort of, I mean, obviously, sort of, I'm assuming that sort of the biggest defense against Russia is assumed to be NATO in the event of a Russian invasion, but of course also there's been a growth in sort of Baltic militaries that was referred to. Can you talk a little bit about this in the Latvian context? I mean, there was actually one of the people, the audience members, I don't know who that is, you can say who you are, sort of talked about sort of the sort of potential policy of conscription and national service. Can you speak to that at all?
Yes, the conscript, it is at the present moment, it is just a concept, which has to be specified and financially justified, and more and more and more. Latvia for a very long time was relying on the professional army, and the reason for that was that Latvia didn't look at Russia as a potential attacking country. Yes, Russia caused different dangers in terms of probably economic influence, political influence, but nobody looked at Russia as military aggressor. And therefore, when we were joining NATO, indeed, it was driven by our security and strengthening ourselves. But at the same time, we were following NATO's path, which was mostly directed as NATO as a serviceman to international security, so-called out-of-area operations. And to participate in international missions, countries need professional army. You cannot rely on conscripts. And therefore, this professional army was more built on the needs of NATO's strategic concept, a little bit putting on the side territorial defense, which was not done in the case of Estonia and also Lithuania. Yeah? So because Lithuania has very big home guards, force. And in Latvia was more focusing small, professional, efficient, and so on. And war in Ukraine taught Latvia and also other countries that actually soldiers matter. So you need quantity. It's not enough that you have only modern technology. Soldiers are very necessary. But what is very important, that also lesson learned from war in Ukraine, is that you need soldiers and you need those who operate on the ground who has very specific knowledge and skills. These could be nurses, these could be IT specialists. So a lot of functions, or for instance, providing food. Yeah, today providing food on the ground is a very, very highly technologically and very advanced capability. So there are a lot of needs during the war. So therefore, this new concept is extension to already existing comprehensive security concept, which was adopted 2.5 years ago, that mobilization requires involvement of citizens in the situation of war. therefore, the first reaction is, how come? So we didn't have conscript, and suddenly from tomorrow on, or from the 1st of January, you are having conscript. No, it's not the case. It's more the discussion and putting forward plans how to prepare society not to be only resilient, but how to society be part of defending the country based on their skills, knowledge, capabilities, whatever they have. So definitely there will be conscript as well, but it is only part of this big picture, which will be actually laid down only later.
So that's really interesting. So I mean, so basically you're saying that, you know, the kind of, well, I'm sure the sort of potential of Russian invasion was always somewhat in the background. That was definitely not considered the sort of the central threat. I mean, and therefore they didn't sort of see as much need to kind of build up a domestic kind of military response that would sort of, specifically in response to Russian invasion. Is that true? Get your response from Andres? And then also, if I mischaracterize your what you said?
No, sorry. The point which I forgot to mention is that it was not excluded from the threat perception, but it was treated as a part of NATO policy of paragraph number 5. So it's not like only Latvia will have to defend, but it will be done jointly with other NATO members.
But I'm sorry, just to sort of push back a little bit. So because I thought what you were saying was that Latvia was focused on sort of building a professional military, primarily, you know, to take part in other kind of NATO operations, but not so much sort of kind of building up defenses along the Russian border. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. Okay. Exactly. So, but those capabilities which Latvia built as a NATO member state, it also serves security needs of Latvia.
Of course.
Like for instance, coastal guards, Navy, small, efficient, able to act in case of crisis. So these are very specific capabilities which could be used both for NATO needs and also for national needs, and for the Baltic needs as well.
Great. Andres, you want to?
Yeah, let me just paint the big picture of how the Baltic states fit into the NATO. That, as I mentioned earlier, that after joining in 2004, NATO had no presence until 2014. For the first decade, all we had was NATO ad hoc air policing of 4 aircraft on a rotational basis from NATO member states patrolling our skies for all 3 Baltic countries. So that was it. It changed with Crimea in 2014. 2016, NATO decided on what's known as the enhanced forward presence. And you saw that in the map that Tomas showed, where there's a NATO multinational battalion in each country, and Canada is the lead partner in Latvia, something that a lot of Canadians aren't aware of. But that was all based on this concept of being a tripwire force. So it's not enough to defend the country, it's enough to trigger Article 5, which Janeta was just talking about. So the Balts would have to defend themselves, and then NATO would come after several days to the rescue, but not through the Vlasov Gap, as Tomas was showing, because that would be cut off. It would be a very difficult situation. So what the Baltic countries were all arguing in the run-up to the NATO summit, which was just 2 weeks ago, was that we have to switch from this concept of deterrence to a concept of denial. In other words, that you meet the threat immediately, because as we saw with the Russian atrocities in Bucha and elsewhere, once Russia conquers some territory, the human cost is horrible. And the Baltic states don't want to be liberated by NATO. We want to be defended at the spot. So rather than having the tripwire force as it has been to now, which would trigger a NATO response that would come sort of later in, come into the area, we want that to move up from a battalion to a brigade, and for that presence to be permanent rather than rotational, which has been the problem because we have this NATO-Russia Founding Act from 1997, which talks about not stationing any permanent substantial combat troops in the new member states in the current and foreseeable security environment, which of course the Balts have argued since 2014 that security environment no longer exists. It's been violated by Russia. There's no reason to hold on to that limitation.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe a number of questions come from this. First of all, so I just want to be clear. I mean, if we think about Finland, which has very strong, my understanding, domestic military components. It's already kind of it wasn't a member of NATO until now it's joining, but it was highly militarized. And my sense is that am I correct that the other Baltic states were not nearly as militarized? Is that right? I mean,
yeah. If I can join it, of course, the main issue for the Baltic states still persists that armies in the Baltic states are still unmanned and still very small. For example, Lithuanian military forces, which are biggest in the Baltics, still right now has maybe about 15,000 military men. Of course, besides that, there is quite a big riflemen's union. It's volunteers who can join in some military operations just on the spot. There are also volunteering people who are training for these military tasks. But still, if you have, for example, just local armies in the Baltics, altogether it could be, I don't know, maybe 25,000 of armed personnel. Compared with Russian military is just nothing. This is why for a long time, even in Lithuania, which spent quite a lot in recent years increasing its military forces, but even in Lithuania, the concept how to stick on this deterrence momentum and how to rely on NATO's Article 5, it was long persisting idea that we still, it doesn't depend how much we spent on military, 2% or 3% or 5%, it would not change so much the balance of forces in this region. So the first task for us is to have NATO fully involved in the defense of Baltics in any case, to have this political support and political unity unquestionable. And this is what this was the main strategy of security in the Baltics. But now, even relying on the same point and still stating that deterrence and defense implemented by all NATO, to say by all allies, is still the main basing point of our security. But still, we have to be ready to engage in any military situation by our forces as well. We cannot rely just about the help coming in some future weeks or months. We have to stop Russian aggression just at the same moment they are crossing our borders. That's why we need to increase our quality and quantity of our national armies. That's why Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia are procuring just a huge quantities of military equipment right now, especially increasing air defense systems. This is also some lesson from Ukraine. You have to defend your sky. And those equipment should be brought into Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia just right now. Maybe to deploy some huge quantities of personnel is a bit difficult task, but to station in advance military equipment, it's much easier task. And so that's why Lithuanian, Latvian, and Estonian military representatives also argue not only about providing some brigades for the Baltic states, but also to plan how to station military equipment in advance to that. So just to sum up, I think that this military thinking in the Baltic states are changing as well, and very specific plans how to integrate national forces into maybe upcoming NATO brigades. This military concept is evolving right now.
I think, yeah, no, that raises a great question, which is kind of probably end up being the last question, which is, you know, I'm wondering to what extent, sort of, what lessons, in a sense, have the Baltic states learned from Ukraine's, you know, defense of its own country? I mean, you know, it seems to be two things come to mind, you know, from what you're saying, Tomas. One is that, you know, I think, you know, in Ukraine, we talk a lot about sort of the 40 million army, right? That the army itself was, you know, relatively small, performed very well, but nonetheless, what really defended Ukraine was the spontaneous kind of actions of its entire population that sort of kind of that pushed back Russia initially. The second thing, which is quite striking in terms of what you were saying, Tomas, is the fact that everybody expected the Ukrainian Air Force to be wiped out immediately. And the fact that one of the reasons why Ukraine has done so well in the war was that it maintained its Air Force, you know, and prevented the Russians from controlling the skies, which sort of made a massive difference in terms of military outcomes. So maybe if I could just get you, Janeta or Andras, just what have been, how have the Baltic states seen sort of Ukraine as a kind of model in terms of its own? What lessons might they have learned, or and the like? I don't know who, if either of you want to take that up, or
maybe just for starting point, you are very right about the role of the society and this willingness to defend your country. I think this is also a reminder for us that political will, and not only by the politicians or by military representatives, but this will to stay and to defend your country is maybe the most important future of resistance of any country. And in our countries, of course, this is related to the very extent because our military forces are not so strong, not so big, and integration of this societal resilience into a military defense system, it's very important factor. And that's why, at least in Lithuania, we also decided to increase this level of preparedness, how society could resist in any, not only military crisis, but in any contingency. Because, for example, we just beside Vilnius, we have a very unsafe nuclear power plant in Astral. So for us, this contingency may involve even some nuclear disaster, for example. So to increase this awareness of public and resilience of public, it's one of the most crucial tasks for now. And this is a lesson from Ukraine as well, because if society is strong enough to resist aggression, it's much easier for anybody else, including military staff, including allies from NATO to provide help. So I think this relationship and integration of society and military is much of the biggest task right now.
Right, Janeta, do you want to sort of speak to that? And we'll wrap it up and then send it to you, Andras.
Thank you. Yeah. I will just mention a few points. I fully agree that my first point would be like Tomas' point on societal resilience. This is really a very unique experience which was gained during the war, not during conferences and seminars, but really on the ground. Second point, I would say political leadership, because political leadership in such situations is of huge importance. And the third point, it is a strategic communication, because Ukraine is definitely very successful in strategic communication, particularly as far as international community is concerned. And the final point is that Ukraine demonstrated not only their ability to consolidate their own society, but actually they consolidated Europe. And this is something what we were not able to do ourselves.
Sorry, if you just clarify quickly, strategic communication between whom?
Strategic communication inside the country and strategic communication outside.
Okay, great. Andres, you're gonna wrap it up this panel.
Okay, I'm not going to subscribe to everything my colleagues have just said, so I won't repeat that, but I will bring in another point, which is that I believe that the Baltic states are much more secure now than they were prior to the conflict, particularly thanks to NATO and Sweden joining, Finland and Sweden joining NATO, and now basically the whole Baltic Sea area being a NATO lake. That gives us strategic depth. It's one sort of strategic theater. However, what I want to say in conclusion is that we have been talking a lot about we need to support Ukraine, because if Russia's not stopped there, then we are next. And that, of course, is important for building strategic security in our region. However, if we overemphasize that, then you see the effect of, for instance, foreign investment in our countries, which has dropped off precipitously from the war. Because if you're sitting in Singapore and wondering where to invest, and you think, oh, the Baltic countries are next. So how to strike that balance between strengthening our security and turning attention to the need for that, but not sort of undermining our own economic prosperity, is what I want to finish on.
Very important point. And of course, it's something that in the run-up to the war, I think Zelensky was very concerned himself about this issue and the like. Okay, thank you both, all three of you, Tomas, Janeta, and Andres. That was a really wonderful discussion. Everyone, we're gonna next week, July 25th. That's next week. We're gonna have a specialist from the Congressional Research Service who's gonna come and talk about the military situation in Ukraine and answer every question you have about HIMARS that you could possibly think of. So until that moment, thank you so much, and Slava Ukraini. Ciao.